Here's the thing about the Bengal famine of 1943 that changes everything once you understand it. It was not a food shortage. Not in the way that phrase is usually understood. There was no catastrophic crop failure. There was no drought. A 2019 climate study, using soil moisture data covering more than a century of Indian agricultural history, analyzed 6 major Indian famines between 1873 and 1943. 5 of them were unambiguously caused by drought, soil moisture collapse, agricultural failure. The 6th, 1943, showed above-average rainfall during the worst months of the crisis. The 1943 Bengal rice harvest was, by Amartya Sen's calculation, only about 5% below the 5-year average. It was, in fact, 13% higher than the 1941 harvest, and there was no famine in 1941. The food was there. Up to 3 million people died anyway. The death toll estimates range from 800,000 on the conservative end to 3.8 million at the upper bound. The most cited figure among historians is approximately 3 million. 3 million people in a province with enough food to feed them, dying of starvation and the diseases that follow it. How do you explain that? The conventional answer, the answer that fills most Western accounts, is a combination of natural disaster and wartime constraint. The Japanese had captured Burma, cutting off rice imports. A cyclone struck coastal Bengal in October 1942. The war demanded resources. Shipping was scarce. These are real events. None of them is fabricated. But here is the contrarian truth that this video is built around. Every one of those factors was a multiplier applied to pre-existing conditions that British wartime policy had created, worsened, or refused to correct. The natural shocks were real. The deaths were not inevitable. Between the natural shock and the death toll, there were 5 specific, documented resource decisions. Decisions made through a colonial supply chain that treated Bengal not as a population to be protected, but as a logistics input to be optimized. This is not primarily a video about Winston Churchill. Churchill appears in this story, and his role is real and contested, and we will address it honestly. But focusing on one man's contempt for Indian lives, and Churchill's documented statements about Indians were genuinely appalling, risks turning a systemic story into a personal one. It risks letting the system off the hook. The Bengal famine was a supply chain failure. It was a resource allocation failure. It was a wartime logistics operation that treated Indian food security as a residual claim, something that got whatever was left after military priorities, after export obligations, after Calcutta's industrial workforce, after British stockpiles in the Mediterranean, after everyone else had taken their share. When nothing was left, 3 million people died. The supply chain that produced this outcome did not happen by accident. It was built decision by decision across 1942 and 1943 by administrators, merchants, generals, and a war cabinet that received clear warnings from their own officials in India about what was happening and chose, repeatedly, to prioritize something else. Let's trace those decisions, because understanding how this supply chain was designed is the only way to understand how it killed. To understand what happened in Bengal in 1943, you need to understand what Bengal meant to the British war effort in 1942. Bengal was not, in British wartime planning, primarily a population center. It was a strategic asset. It was the Eastern Front. It was the industrial base. Calcutta alone produced more than half of British India's war-related manufacturing output by 1943. Jute mills, textile factories, coal mines, munitions plants, engineering firms, all concentrated in and around the city. Over 1 million military and war industry workers were employed in the greater Calcutta area by the height of the war. Bengal was also the geographic buffer between British India and Japanese-occupied Burma. After the fall of Rangoon in March 1942, the British military's nightmare scenario was a Japanese land invasion pushing west through Bengal toward Calcutta. The loss of Burma had already cost India 15% of its annual rice imports. Burma had been one of the region's major rice exporters, and that supply line was now severed at a stroke. And Bengal was, from the British military's perspective, a potential Japanese beachhead, a coastline to be defended, and if necessary, denied. That word, denied, is central to everything that follows. The wartime British administration in India operated under a doctrine called the denial policy. The logic was straightforward military thinking. If the Japanese invade coastal Bengal, they must not be allowed to use local resources, food, transport, communication infrastructure, to supply and sustain their advance. Therefore, those resources must be removed or destroyed in advance of any invasion. In practice, this meant British and Indian Army units moving through coastal Bengal, confiscating and destroying boats, rice stalks, carts, bicycles, and elephants. Not in response to an actual invasion, in advance of a hypothetical one. The policy was internally controversial. Qasim Fazl Huq, the chief minister of Bengal, protested directly to London. He argued that the policy was creating conditions for famine, that destroying the boats on which Bengal's entire coastal and river economy depended would devastate fishing communities, halt local rice trade, and sever the distribution networks that moved food from surplus to deficit areas within the province. London's Director of Civil Supplies dismissed these concerns. There was, he insisted, sufficient rice available. At the same time, the wartime economy was doing something else to Bengal's food supply. Something less visible and more insidious. To fund the war, the British Indian government was printing money. Enormous volumes of currency were being pushed into the economy to pay for military escalation, war industries, and troop deployments. This monetary inflation was creating a violent divergence in purchasing power across Bengal's population. Military workers, defense industry employees, and civil servants in Calcutta were receiving wages that, while not indexed to inflation, were at least being paid in cash, in proximity to subsidized food schemes. Agricultural laborers in rural Bengal were not. Their wages, denominated in traditional arrangements rather than cash, were stagnating while food prices were rising. Between 1939 and 1943, food grain prices in Bengal rose by more than 300%. Agricultural laborer wages rose by approximately 30%. The food was becoming unaffordable, not because it disappeared, but because the monetary infrastructure of the war had systematically stripped rural Bengal's workers of their purchasing power. These were the conditions in Bengal when the 1942 cyclone hit. The cyclone was real. It destroyed the Midnapore rice harvest. It killed people. It added a genuine supply shock to a system that was already under severe stress. But it was not, by itself, enough to cause a famine at the scale that followed. What turned that cyclone damage into 3 million deaths were 5 additional decisions, made through a colonial supply chain that had clear priorities, and rural Bengal was not among them. Decision number 1, the denial policy, destroying the supply chain from the inside the first. Decision was the one that made everything else catastrophic. The full implementation of the denial policy across coastal Bengal. In 1942, the policy had a military logic. It is worth stating that, honestly, with Japanese forces holding Burma, with Japanese submarines patrolling the Bay of Bengal, with Japanese aircraft bombing Calcutta in December 1942, the fear of a coastal invasion was not paranoid. British military planners believed, incorrectly but not irrationally, that Bengal's coastline was vulnerable. The denial policy's implementation, however, went far beyond military necessity, as most military historians understand it. By April 1942, the government had destroyed approximately 18,000 boats in just one region, Tamluk district alone. Across coastal Bengal, the total reached approximately 46,000 boats capable of carrying more than 10 passengers. One civil servant, describing the impact on Bengal's fishing communities, said the policy had completely broken the economy of the fishing class. That phrase does not convey the magnitude of what it meant. Bengal's rural economy was not like a modern industrial economy, where disrupting one sector creates pressure on others that eventually rebalances. Bengal's rural economy in 1942 was a subsistence network, a web of small exchanges, local market days, inter-village trade in rice, fish, vegetables, and produce that depended entirely on physical movement. Boats were not a convenience. They were the infrastructure. Destroy the boats, and you destroy the movement of food within the province. Local surpluses cannot reach local deficits. A village with grain cannot sell it to a village that needs it because there is no way to move it. In a province where half to three-quarters of the rural poor were already described as subsisting in a semi-starved condition, removing the distribution infrastructure of local food trade was not a military precaution. It was the first link in a chain of supply failures. The rice denial content of the policy was equally damaging. Soldiers confiscated and destroyed rice stocks deemed to be surplus. Surplus being defined as more than immediate household needs. According to contemporary accounts, thousands of tons of rice were thrown into rivers in eastern Bengal. The logic: deny it to the Japanese if they come. The effect: deny it to Bengalis who needed it now. Neither the boat denial nor the rice denial was reversed when it became clear that no Japanese invasion was coming to the coastline where these policies had been implemented. The boats were gone, the rice was gone. The distribution network that rural Bengal had depended on for generations was dismantled in a matter of months. Decision number 2, the foodstuffs scheme. Redirecting rice from hungry to essential. The second decision was the creation of the foodstuffs scheme, a wartime priority rationing system that concentrated available food in Calcutta's war-essential workforce while the countryside starved. In August 1942, as the signs of food stress were already becoming visible, the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, composed primarily of British-owned firms, devised a plan. The plan was straightforward: to prevent essential war industry workers from leaving their posts due to food insecurity, the government would guarantee them a subsidized food supply. The scheme was approved by the government of Bengal and implemented across the greater Calcutta area. Workers in munitions plants, textile mills, railway yards, engineering firms, paper factories, coal mines, and various categories of civil and military employment were enrolled in a priority distribution system. They received subsidized rice, in some cases paid partially in weekly rice rations sufficient to feed their immediate families. This sounds, in isolation, like pragmatic wartime policy. And it was, from the narrow perspective of keeping Calcutta's war machine running. Over 1 million military and industrial workers were employed in the city. Losing them would have genuinely damaged the war effort. The problem was the other side of the ledger. The rice being directed to Calcutta's priority workers was being redirected away from the rural districts where the food stress was visibly worsening. The Bengal government was actively combing the countryside, seizing rice from mills and warehouses to feed the priority scheme. When that requisitioning accelerated after the December 1942 Japanese bombing of Calcutta triggered a market panic, rice was being pulled out of the rural supply chain at the precise moment that the rural population had the least ability to absorb the loss. The scheme created what economist Amartya Sen later called a perfect model of entitlement failure. The food did not vanish from Bengal. It was redirected. The people who starved were not in a food-free zone. They were in a zone where the food that existed had been priced out of their reach, rerouted to someone else's priority, or physically removed from their distribution network. By early 1943, with prices rising faster than any rural laborer's wage could follow, families were making decisions that are almost impossible to comprehend. Men selling their small farms for stacks of rice. Parents selling children, with no buyers to be found as the crisis deepened. Women traveling alone to Calcutta, the city that was consuming Bengal's food, looking for any form of organized relief. The streets of Calcutta were filling with dying people from the countryside who had walked, in some cases for days, to reach a city that had the food that had been taken from them. Decision number 3. The inflation engine. Making food unaffordable without removing it. The third decision was less visible than the first two because it operated through monetary mechanics rather than physical policy. But its impact on Bengal's food security was no less direct. To finance the war, the British Indian government had adopted a credit mechanism that essentially amounted to printing money. Britain agreed to pay India for war-related expenditures above peacetime levels, but those payments were accumulated as sterling credits in the Bank of England, not redeemable until after the war. The Bank of India, in turn, was permitted to treat those sterling credits as assets against which it could print rupee currency at roughly 2.5 times the credit value. What this meant in practice was that India's money presses ran continuously, generating the rupee supply that paid for military escalation, war industry expansion, troop deployments, and 100 other wartime expenses. The money supply expanded dramatically. Goods, particularly food, did not expand to match it. The result was wartime inflation, severe, accelerating, and brutally unequal in its impact. Between 1939 and 1943, food grain prices in Bengal rose by more than 300%. The wages of agricultural laborers, the largest class of vulnerable people in rural Bengal, rose by approximately 30% over the same period. That gap is not a policy failure in any subtle sense. It is a direct mathematical consequence of a monetary policy that enriched the war economy while impoverishing the rural poor. Military workers and war industry employees in Calcutta were insulated from this by the foodstuffs scheme. They had guaranteed access to subsidized rice. Their wages, while not fully inflation-adjusted, were supplemented by in-kind food payments. Rural agricultural laborers had none of this. Their wages were traditional. Their access to food markets was disrupted, and every month they were buying food in a market that was running 300% above the price levels at which their wages had been set. The food was on the shelves, visible, real, available to whoever could pay for it. For Bengal's rural poor, in 1943, that meant it was functionally inaccessible. Amartya Sen called this an entitlement failure. The phrase is precise, but clinical. What it describes is people looking at food they cannot reach, not because it is absent, but because the monetary architecture of a war they did not choose to fight had stripped them of the economic rights that would have let them buy it. Decision number 4. The exports that continued during the famine. The fourth decision is the one that is most difficult to explain in any framework that credits British wartime policy with good faith. Between January and July 1943, as the famine was visibly unfolding, as reports of mass starvation were reaching the government of Bengal and the viceroy in Delhi, as the streets of Calcutta were filling with skeletal figures from the countryside, India continued to export rice. The figure documented by researchers is more than 70,000 tons of rice exported in that 6-month period. Historians studying the famine have calculated that this rice alone, had it remained in Bengal, would have been sufficient to keep approximately 400,000 people alive for an entire year. The export continued because stopping it required a deliberate policy decision, an intervention in the free market trade that the colonial government was philosophically reluctant to make and practically unprepared to enforce. The argument in London was that interfering with rice exports would damage commercial relationships, undermine market confidence, and set precedents that would complicate post-war trade. The argument in Bengal, from the chief minister, from famine observers, from the people watching their populations die, was that the argument in London was killing people. War Cabinet shipping records examined by historian Madhusri Mukherjee show Australian wheat flour during this period being routed to Ceylon, the Middle East, and Southern Africa, across the Indian Ocean, but not to India. Churchill's War Cabinet had been told by the Secretary of State for India, Leopold Amery, exactly what was happening. Amery's communications to Churchill described rotting corpses lining the streets of Calcutta. Churchill's documented response was to ask how, if the food shortages were so severe, Mahatma Gandhi was still alive. That response is extraordinary, not for its cruelty, though it is cruel, but for its informational content. It tells you what model of India the War Cabinet was operating with. India was a resource question, not a welfare question. The answer to reports of mass starvation was a rhetorical question about one famous man, not a question about supply lines, shipping capacity, or food policy. The exports continued. Decision number 5, the blocked import requests. The fifth decision is, in some ways, the most structurally important, because it is the decision that could have stopped the others from becoming a catastrophe. Beginning as early as December 1942, A series of senior British officials in India began formally requesting emergency food imports for Bengal. The list of those requesting aid reads like a roll call of the British military and civil establishment in the region. The governor of Bengal, the viceroy, the commander-in-chief of British forces in India, the supreme commander of Southeast Asia. By mid-1943, these requests had reached the level of formal, urgent, documented appeals to London for approximately 1 million tons of emergency grain. London said no, repeatedly. The stated reason was shipping. Wartime shipping was under enormous strain. The Axis powers had sunk more than 230 Allied merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean in the preceding 18 months. Every ship that went to India was a ship that wasn't going somewhere else. The war needed it. The Atlantic crossing to supply Britain and support European operations had absolute priority. These constraints were real, but they were also, in several documented instances, inconsistently applied. War Cabinet shipping assignments in August 1943, made immediately after Amory had formally pleaded for famine relief, show grain being routed to Ceylon, the Middle East, and southern Africa. The Indian Ocean shipping was not idle. It was carrying food to places other than Bengal. The choice to exclude Bengal from those allocations was a deliberate prioritization, not simply a scarcity. In 1943, at the height of the famine, Britain imported 26 million tons of food and raw materials for its own civilian population, building a stockpile of 18.5 million tons by year's end. The British Empire's total wheat harvest in the 1943 to 44 growing year was approximately 29 million tons. It was preserved for future use. The War Cabinet had been told, directly, by its own officials, that a famine was killing millions of people in Bengal. The decision was made, again and again, to prioritize something else. Lord Wavell, appointed viceroy in October 1943, when the famine was already past its worst acute phase, but the disease deaths that follow starvation were still compounding, was furious. He made his views clear. He wrote that it appeared to be more important to save the Greeks and newly liberated Europeans than the Indians. He pressed London relentlessly for the grain shipments that his predecessors had been denied. By the end of 1944, Wavell had eventually secured more than 1 million tons of grain, much of it from Australia, routed to Bengal. The acute famine was over, though deaths from the diseases that follow starvation, cholera, malaria, smallpox, continued well into 1944 and accounted for more than half the total famine-related mortality. The famine that was not caused by a food shortage had been ended by a food import. The logic of that sequence is difficult to escape. Here is the lesson this supply chain teaches, and it is a logistics lesson, not simply a moral one. The Bengal famine of 1943 was, as Amartya Sen defined it, a famine of entitlement failure. People died not because food was absent from Bengal, but because a sequence of policy decisions had destroyed their ability to access food that was present. The supply chain had been redesigned step by step to route Bengal's food resources toward military priority and away from rural subsistence. The denial policy destroyed the distribution infrastructure. The foodstuff scheme redirected existing supply. The inflation mechanism destroyed purchasing power. The continued exports removed available supply. The blocked import requests prevented correction. Each decision had an internal logic: military security, war industry retention, monetary management, commercial obligation, strategic shipping allocation. None of the individual decisions required anyone to intend for 3 million people to die. What they required was for the system to treat Indian lives as a residual claim, something that would be addressed after every other priority was satisfied. When a supply chain is designed that way and then hit by a natural shock, the cyclone, the loss of Burma's rice, the residual claim gets nothing. The shock absorbs everything that was left for the lowest priority claimants, and the lowest priority claimants die. This is not a historical curiosity. Wartime resource allocation still works this way. Modern supply chains, for food, for medicine, for energy, still contain residual claimants. The populations, regions, and demographics that receive what's left after primary priorities are satisfied. The systems themselves are rarely designed with explicit intent to harm those residual claimants. The harm comes from the design, from the priority hierarchy that the system encodes, not from individual malice. Understanding that distinction is what makes the Bengal famine useful beyond its historical moment. The question it forces you to ask about any resource allocation system is not whether anyone intended the outcome, it is who ends up with the residual claim, and what happens to them when the system is under stress. In 1943, the answer was Bengal, and 3 million people paid for it. Now here is where this arc connects to where we're going next. Britain's railway system in India, the one we traced in Video 1, was built to move resources from the interior to the ports. The East India Company, the institution we traced in Video 2, was built to convert territorial control into shareholder returns. And the supply chain we just traced in Video 3 was built to treat Indian resources as inputs into a British war machine. All three of those systems had the same design logic. Resources flow toward imperial priority. Local welfare is the residual. The Bengal famine of 1943 was not an aberration of British colonial policy. It was British colonial policy operating under maximum stress, revealing its actual hierarchy of priorities with maximum clarity. The next arc of this series takes that design logic and moves it to a different empire, a different continent, and a different infrastructure project that followed the exact same pattern. But this time, the empire that ran out of residual capacity wasn't India, it was France. And the project was the Suez Canal.